What's up, Swolgers? Thanks for joining me on today's video where we're going to talk about what type of shoes should you wear for Strongman. Plus, we'll also break down some advice on foot care and give you a few examples from some pros and what they use when they are training and competing. So when we're choosing the right shoes and footwear for Strongman, there's a lot of different variables that go into making a good choice to help you succeed in competitions and training. So that's what this video is all about today. Before we start breaking it down, please do me a favor, hit the like button and please click subscribe to the channel for more content on Strongman and all things getting swole in the mind, body, and soul. For today's video, we're gonna break this down into a couple different categories. And this is all about helping you make the right choice of what you need to do your best. So we'll talk about the types of events you may see, the types of surfaces you may be on, all these different types of shoes that you could use, personal differences and preferences, advice on foot care, and then again, some examples from some pros. So let's start with types of events. Let's go ahead and group static and loading kind of into the same category. When we're talking types of events, why we want to start here is, we're going to use kind of general principles about what's going to work best for these types of events. So we'll cover, again, maybe what types of shoes are best for that. But as far as principles go, static events are anything where you're standing in place and performing a lift. So this could be a deadlift or a squat, a press, loading, anything that you're taking up and over a bar onto a platform, or also really shouldering is a loading in some senses. But again, the principles here are that we're looking to have the ability to apply as much strength, pressure, and force into the surface that we're lifting on. So here's what we want to avoid when we're doing static and loading events. We want to avoid things like runners or cross trainers with soft soles that are going to literally absorb the pressure that you're putting in. Okay, this is just like as if you wanted to jump as high as possible, would you rather do it on a hardwood surface or like a big soft pillow? Think about, if you're going to try and jump and gain that momentum, if you were on a pillow, you're literally going to sink into that soft pillow. It'll absorb some of your power and you won't be able to jump as high. So that in a kind of different context is what happens when you're using things like runners. Those are built on purpose to give you a little absorption. So it does like protect your knees and things like that when you're doing long distance running, but it is not going to give you the same type of power output and strength when you need to lift a maximal weight. All right. So that could be different types of shoes or even barefoot. I personally am a barefoot deadlifter because I feel like that gives me the best ability to ground into the floor and once again apply that max pressure and strength to lift my heaviest. So moving events have a lot of variability because they could be heavy, they could be light. So this is something you need to kind of judge based on what it is that you're doing. This can only really come through practice reps in training. There are different times for me, for example, where I might choose a harder soled shoe if it's a really heavy thing like a yoke carry. I have found from personal experience, I used to train in basketball shoes a lot for like almost every single event. But once I started working to heavier and heavier yokes as I got stronger, I would take a lift in the yoke and I would take a step and I would feel squish in that shoe. I could feel it all the way up into my knees and my hips. It just didn't allow me to get my proper alignment. So I knew from then I need something like with these static and loading events that's got a hard connection to the floor. Now, other things you want to consider, and this is kind of up to you, is do you want your ankles to be able to move around a lot? Are you doing something like a yoke or a farmer's carry that's in a straight line where you want like maybe some harder canvas around the outside of your feet? Again, only things that you can learn and figure out by playing with. If I'm doing something like a medley where you're gonna have to run down, drop something, maybe run back, where you might have a little bit of lateral movement, that is a situation where I might like a little bit looser canvas on the shoe itself because I can have a little more mobility in my ankles to move around. But you may be less flexible than me. You might want something that gives you more support. Totally up to you. Lastly, vehicle pull. So vehicle pull, what you're looking for is something that's got a really, really good grip on the bottom of the sole. These are things that are usually done in a straight line. So like we talked about with moving, you don't really need a whole lot of like lateral movement where you would need to step in and out. So people tend to recommend things like rock climbing shoes because it's just thin canvas and very hard rubber on the bottom that's going to allow you to dig into the surface that you're moving on and get a good, strong push off. Now, just do want to break down something like a vehicle pull shoe versus a static and loading shoe. A rock climber shoe or some of these trainers that have that like harder sole have sometimes like a curve or a shape to like the arch of them that is meant to provide better grip as the priority instead of like a flat bottom, which will allow you to spread your pressure evenly through the floor. So things like a rock climbing shoe might not make sense up here because you're not able to put that pressure and power into it. But again, only things that you can figure out by trial and error. So not only do you need to consider what type of event are we doing here, but you need to consider the type of surface that you're going to be on. So let's start with asphalt. Almost all of us have done some sort of parking lot show or done things that are like out in the street. I tend to find that asphalt is actually one of the better surfaces kind of all around because it tends to have a pretty good grip depending on what type of shoe that you're wearing. With the exception being sometimes things like lifters do not have, those grips and those ridges on the bottom of them, but that doesn't matter if you're using those for a stationary lift. So when you're using asphalt, kind of look for, again, really anything that's going to grip that surface really well, and then refer to what you need for whatever type of event it is. Now, that's a pretty big difference from things like turf. There aren't as many strongman competitions on a turf surface, but because of sometimes that crumb rubber that's on it and the actual like turf substance itself, you might be pretty prone to slip on that type of surface. So just kind of play around with this. And now you need to remember, as we're talking about this, most good strongmen are going to have several different types of shoes that they're bringing in their bag on game day to make a good decision on what they're going to want to use. And sometimes you might not know, you might not get to train on this type of surface. So plan ahead, be strategic, and even look up some videos like online or consult with other people that have done this before to ask them what they would recommend before you go into this type of show. So that's also pretty different from an expo hall or like a smooth, polished cement floor. While sometimes that same like rubber grip is going to work pretty well, other times these surfaces are so slick and smooth that your normal shoes that would grip almost anywhere else become too smooth and they can't get a connection on that surface. So very famously, like at the Arnold Amateur this last year, there were several athletes that slipped on the floor doing a heavy backward sled drag. So many people opted to go barefoot after seeing a lot of their other competitors do that. So they were making that choice based on what other people were failing with. So be prepared to analyze again what other competitors are doing. One tip that I've used before is to actually put a little bit of hand sanitizer on the bottom of your shoes to dry them out, which will help increase friction, right? Other people have also just put a nice hard line of tape on the balls of their feet over the shoe to help grip even more. I have never done that personally, but I've seen it happen. So try it out if you feel like it might be beneficial to you. Another totally different type of surface, sand. Sand, this also could include, for the sake of this video, like a clay pitch, like a rodeo type surface. So these are all pretty even for the most part, like even flat surfaces. Sand could be all over the place. So a lot of stuff goes out the window as far as stability. I would recommend for a sand surface, something that gives you a little bit of ankle support. Again, if you got to move laterally or you take a misstep in like a divot, something that'll kind of keep your foot in place, a little more rigid position so you can keep moving in the direction that you need to go, okay? But really be considerate. It's very unlikely that you're gonna ever compete in ice, but for those of you that might do that watching this video, consider things like ice climbing shoes. It's really gonna be about the best option for you, but it has happened. Sounds crazy, but you never know, okay? Rubber mats. Now, rubber mats, think about like we talked about with some of these runners and trainers that are built to absorb pressure and force. That's why rubber mats exist, period, in gyms, is because they're meant to absorb like weights being dropped. They're meant to protect the floor. So when you get things sometimes that are really, really heavy, you're gonna have potentially, if you're wearing like a soft-soled shoe or a runner and you're putting a lot of force in, you could have like a double squish effect. So not only is that shoe squishing and absorbing your power, but also that rubber mat surface could be as well. Like I've had this happen personally when I was trying a truck pull simulation device. I was wearing, again, basketball shoes like I used to, and I could feel that double squish all the way through the shoe and the rubber mat, and I could tell that it was taking away my power. So just be considerate, what that looks like for you and what you might want to do about that, right? Lastly, wood. Really the only time you're probably gonna be lifting on wood is if you're doing a stationary lift, like a lifting platform. So that would be all these things that we talked about with static and loading. Those elements would pretty much all apply to wood, right? Something that's really hard, or if it's barefoot, whatever's gonna give you the best connection through your body to put as much force and power into the surface to lift at your heaviest, right? So now that we've kind of covered the different types of events and surfaces that you might see, let's talk about the common types of shoes that you could use for all of these. Now I'll give you some recommendations, but this, once again, as I keep saying, is really up to you to try this out for yourself, right? People have different preferences and differences that are gonna make a really big impact on you for the individual. So let's start with flats. Flats are things like Chuck Taylors or Vans or skateboard shoes. And now these are pretty good for multiple different surfaces and types of events. The thing you want to be careful about, again, is like how hard or soft is the sole that you're using. Now what's good about flats is, they get a good coverage under your foot. So you're gonna be able typically to spread your foot inside the shoe pretty well, and then have like a slightly bigger sole on the bottom of it that'll help you spread your feet and pressure more evenly. So this could work pretty well for squats, deadlifts, even moving events, but as always, up to you. Lifters. Lifters are pretty good for static lifts. One thing that I don't recommend is to use them for deadlifts and also things like moving events, because just that little bit of forward tilt on moving events, it kind of ruins your natural gait just a little bit, and it could cause you to be thrown off how you would normally run and walk with things. But it's not necessarily a bad idea if you practice and rehearse with it. Now, sometimes you have to make a decision, if you have like a medley, that you might want to use the shoe that's gonna help you in the weaker point of the medley. So for example, Rogue Invitational did a yoke walk into a log press. So a lot of those guys, if they were just doing a yoke normally, would probably use a hard flat-soled shoe, but because they were going into a log press where they were already under fatigue, most of them opted to use lifters so they could have a better chance of success on the log press, right? So just things to be considering. It's not always going to be purely this or purely this or purely this. You might have to make, kind of an educated decision on what's going to help you the most when you're weighing your different options, okay? So cross trainers, a lot of versatility here, and this is a broad category. I'd also like this to include basketball shoes as we're talking about this. Consider all these things we're talking about. Do you want to be able to move quickly? Are you moving heavy weight? So rule like what it is that you're doing. A lot of times if I have things like a sandbag medley, that's not too terribly heavy. I'm probably, carrying at my heaviest I've ever done at OSG was a 275 sandbag. So that's a weight that I can hold comfortably. That's not putting too much squish, not really any squish into my feet. So I would maybe choose to use something like that, even though it's got a little bit of that squish, because it just helps me, spring a little more on my step. I can, drop a bag and turn real quick and have, a lot of versatility in my movement for that. So just consider cross trainers, and there's also things like high top, low top, which we'll get into, but they are very popular And even some are going to be pretty good for a vehicle pull. This is not an exclusive rock climbing shoe movement. I actually have a pair of no-bull trainers that are extremely hard soled on the bottom, and there's very, very light, flexible, malleable canvas on them. So I tend to like that a lot, and it's what I used to win the pirate ship pull at the OSG regionals a couple weeks ago. So just try these things out. Metcons are pretty popular. I also have a pair of Reebok Nanos from several years ago that are pretty hard soled that I really like. So try these different things out, but not all are made the same. So just do your research, try them out, see what works for you. Now, boots are pretty popular for some of these events as well. There's actually a lot of versatility in these. I've seen a lot of guys that are, in the Army or in the military use their actual like rucking or uniform boots for a lot of these events. And they tend to work pretty well because they have a good hard sole. They have a lot of ankle and foot support around the canvas. And also they tend to have a little bit of a lift in them, like either an inch or half inch. So if you're doing a loading event and it's a pretty high platform and you need to maybe take advantage of getting a little extra inch or half inch, this might be the right move for you to help you achieve that lift. Lifters also have a little bit of the same effect when you get that elevated heel. So play with what you need. If you're a little taller athlete, probably doesn't matter at all. So for things like loading over a bar or a platform, again, with height considerations, you'll see a pretty big versatility of what athletes are using. That's probably got the biggest variability in loading events because you will see cross trainers, you'll see some people do barefoot or just socks, and you'll also see people do lifters. But make that judgment. It's up to you. Try it out. Rock climbing, I also just put ice climbing shoes. We kind of covered this with a vehicle pull. It's really kind of a specialty thing just for vehicles. There's not a whole lot of benefit to using those on all of these other events because they're typically made with the priority and purpose to be as grippy as possible. And they even tend to have a little bit of a enforced or exaggerated arch that's going to allow you to dig into the balls of your feet better. So rock climbing shoes are excellent for things like vehicle pulls. Would not necessarily recommend for anything else. I just included ice. If you ever get there, you might need it, okay? Cleats. Cleats are another specialty thing that you probably only want in turf or in like a sand or clay pitch surface. Now, sand can be a little different because sometimes it's packed, sometimes it's loose. So if you're facing a competition coming up where that is the element at play here, do a little bit of homework because if it's a little more packed, you might be able to get a lot of benefit on a moving event using a little bit of cleats, okay? Minimal or zero shoes. I'm gonna also kind of include this into barefoot / socks. Minimal zero shoes have a pretty much almost no sole whatsoever. It's just like a hard piece of canvas. So those work really well, again, when we're talking about trying to put out max force and max power in these type of movements. They work great because they're not gonna interfere and give you any of that squish like the runners and the trainers that we've talked about. That's similar to being barefoot or in your socks. As I said before, I'm a barefoot deadlifter. I feel like that gives me the best grip out there. Sometimes I do socks, same reason. I just don't like having really anything at all under my feet if I don't have to. Now, one thing you have to be careful with on some of these is whether you have a high or low arch that could be naturally working against what these shoes offer. I'm gonna come right back to that because that's number one on my next topic here. But last one is a wrestling shoe. So a wrestling shoe is another one that is just gonna be providing a lot of good grip on the bottom of that shoe. A lot of versatility here, but it's worth checking out. They also tend to have some that go up a little higher on the ankle to give you a little bit of ankle and calf support. So really good. I've never used them, but looked into them a bunch, just never pulled the trigger and gotten it because I have found what works for me. But take a look into this. So lots of things to consider here. These all would work pretty well depending on what type of event or surface or medley that you're going to use. But for more considerations, you need to think about, again, what works best for you, your personal preferences, and your personal differences. So I briefly kind of got into this with minimal or zero shoes, but I want to break down a high versus flat arch just a little bit more. So on minimal and zero shoes, These can be pretty good for moving events if you want just like a little bit of something on your shoe, but like as little as possible. But what tends to happen with things like the actual brand barefoot shoes, which I've seen happen, is people that have a naturally high arch, that shoe is very, very, very flat. So try to look into either inserts or other completely different brands of shoes that will be conducive to your foot structure to complement what you're doing. Because if you have a naturally high arch and you're wearing a very flat shoe, that's going to be a potential injury risk. You could, rupture your plantar, or even in some worse instances like sprain a calf, sprain an Achilles, things like that, because you're spreading your foot in the incorrect way for your anatomy. Now, if you don't know what I'm talking about, just look at the bottom of your feet. You may not know this, but some people's foot is naturally pretty flat and grips into the ground. Other people have a nice, big, high arch that kind of sits above the floor a little bit. So there are many different like running stores and this and that where you can go check this out for yourself. I really recommend it because it does make a difference, especially if you're going to try out things like barefoot shoes. I strongly recommend seeing what type of arch you have and making sure that you're making the right decision, because these things might just not work for you at all. They're not meant for you if you have a high arch. So consider that. All right, high versus low ankle. So this is just, again, the type of shoe and grade that you're using. I kind of go back and forth on this. Sometimes I like to have a high ankle on like my shoes and my trainers, just because I feel like it gives me a little bit of extra support, as I've been talking about. If I need to, make a quick movement, like in a medley where I'm going and throwing a sandbag and I have to make a quick turn and run back the other direction, I do just like having a little bit of extra support around the ankle. Now, if it's things though, like picking up something heavy from the floor where you really need a lot of flexion through your ankles, such as like Atlas stones, I don't want that, because I need my ankles and my knees, to move as far forward as possible. But might not be an issue for you depending on things like your limb lengths. You might have a really good strong hinge to go and pick up that Atlas stone where you don't need a lot of ankle traction. So just things to kind of consider on what you like and what's going to help you out. That's that. What feels good. There's two sides of this. You should try these out and kind of see what feels good, but not to the sake of like stupidity. Be critically, be a critical analyst of what type of shoe you're wearing. Even if it feels good, is it really doing what's best for you? Is that just what you're used to? Think about that. But I know, for me and my experience, I've tried all these different things. Like, I feel best in some types of shoes versus others, even if they're really similar. Like we talked about, all these different things that have like a soft canvas and a hard sole. That could describe dozens and dozens of types of shoes, but I know I've got two shoes in particular for some of these events. My Reebok Nanos and my No Bull trainers, very similar. Some just feel better than others. Like, I like my Nanos for yokes. I really like my No Bulls for things like truck pulls or moving events like carries and medleys, right? It's just a thing, but they both cover all the basics of what I need, but I have, more of an inclination towards one or the others. Shoe size. Now, I don't know all the ins and outs for some of the bigger guys out there that have got really large feet, but there are different shoes that tend to work better for different size feet, especially if you have like wider feet or just a bigger shoe in general. There are some that are known to fit people a little better. I know, like, for example, a lot of, the taller, bigger pro strongman athletes tend to really like Nike shoes, whether it's, Air Maxes or Metcons. They tend to say that that works better for them. I'm not verifying that or confirming that. That's just a trend of what happens out here, okay? Now, one thing you also want to consider with shoe size is, do you maybe want to go a size down for some of this? If you're doing a lot of moving and you don't want that shoe to slip around on you, make sure it's tight, even to the point where you may want to go down a size for this. And that's exactly what I do. So I actually, for some of the events like truck pulls or moving medleys, I want that good hard connection, and I don't want the shoe to slip around on me. So I tend to go a half size down just so it's a little tighter on my foot. So use that to your advantage if it's gonna help you. Now, we've covered all these different types of things that could go into this, but what's really important is taking care of your feet as well. This is something when I first learned about it that really changed the game for me, and I didn't realize just how much of an impact it had on me. But think about this. You know, as a strongman athlete, you're on your feet moving a lot of heavy weight, so you're constantly putting a lot of pressure down, all the way down. It's all going down into your feet. And your feet, like the rest of your body, have muscle fascia. So we need to make sure that it's not overly tight and that you're doing things to take care of it and allow you to be your strongest and best, allows you to grip the floor. So doing things like, you know, some fascial release, whether that is rolling the bottom of your foot and your arches on a lacrosse ball or using like a Theragun on your feet, like it really, really works pretty well. You know, you can try this for yourself. You know, if you've never done this, get a lacrosse ball, you know, get that Theragun, or I even have, you know, one of those car buffers like Eddie Hall, would run it on the bottom of my feet. If I haven't done it for a while, I'll notice my foot is spread out a little bit more. It's a little more relaxed. I'm able to even use my toes to grip in a little bit better. So it's, again, all about getting that best connection possible to the floor. So take care of your feet. Also do things like toe spacers, right? Like when we're in some of these shoes, especially if you're doing something that's with a smaller shoe size, we're compressing our feet with all of that force and tension on there. So using those toe spacers, the ones that go in just like this to spread out, will also stretch out again and relieve some of that muscle fascia in your shoes. Something that I've never used before, but is recommended by a good handful of people, are compression socks. Now this is just giving your legs, you know, could be all the way up to your knees, just like that nice little bit of compression to help increase blood flow to those areas. And this is, again, all about like trying to make sure that everything in and around your feet is getting a lot of circulation and recovery. So maybe compression socks are worth a shot. This is something that I've seen Andrew Clayton use a lot for this. So, you know, again, try these things out. It's worth checking out to make sure that you are healthy and able to get the most out of all of these things. This is all important because, you know, it's all one big piece. So if your feet are tight, it's pulling on muscles that are going all the way up, you know, into your calves, your legs, and even your hips and low back. It all starts from your feet. A lot of times things like, you know, ankle, calf, knee, hip issues actually start all the way down in your foot, right? They call this like the bad neighbor theory. Most of the time, not always, most of the time, if you have like pain, let's say in like your knee, it's caused by somewhere north or south on the train. And a lot of times it could be your foot. So check it out. You know, you just got to make sure that all of this stuff is, you know, in working order as you should with any other part of your body to make sure that you are healthy and in a good position to lift and perform well, right? So take care of your feet. Just a couple pro examples to kind of, you know, get towards the end here. Last weekend at the Strongest Man on Earth competition, Austin Andrade wore Vans on every single lift. So when we're thinking about versatility and stuff, coming back to some of this, you know, you can use the same shoe or shoes for multiple things. They do work pretty well. I don't know exactly why he does that. I don't disagree, but just something that I've noticed. Now, Brian Shaw, on the other hand, as I kind of talked about with, you know, bigger, taller guys, he tends to use Air Maxes, or used in the past when he was doing a lot of his events. You know, I went back and watched Strongest Man on Earth last year, previous events, even things like keg toss on some yokes, on medleys. He was always wearing these Air Maxes. He also did that on stones. So for consideration, I talked about lifters, you know, how you want to make sure that you have like enough ankle mobility for this and that to get in the right position. That clearly was not much of an issue for him, nor obviously was height. So I've seen him do Air Maxes for a lot of stuff. And then Thor wears Jordans for all sorts of stuff. I've seen him do it on Husafell carries, on farmer's walks, on keg tosses, you know, so there's really a lot of variability here. Now, I would not be surprised if any of these three types of guys had inserts or something, or maybe like a different sole, or even potentially like remove that inner lining sole to get a harder connection into that shoe. I can't say for sure. I tried to look into that, but I couldn't find any info. Now I wanted to look into some more old school guys as well. I couldn't find any, specific examples of exactly what it was, but when I was looking at guys like, Mariusz Pudzianowski or Magnus Magnuson or even Bill Kazmaier, I just noticed a couple similarities that I just want to bring up. They all were wearing what looked to be some sort of wrestling type shoe that had high laces that went up a little bit up onto the ankle. So while I can't really tell what that is, just kind of a similarity that I found that I thought was cool. So that is kind of a good breakdown, a big thorough analysis on what shoes you should be wearing for Strongman. I've said it probably 5 or 6 times in this video, but at the end of the day, this comes down to trial and error. You have to try these different things out for you. You also need to be a student of the game and figure out what surface am I going to be on? Is it a medley? Do I need to prioritize one movement over the other when I'm thinking about footwear? And then just try these things out. It really comes down to that. Everything is reps, 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 reps. Repetition is the mother of skill. So that's why you need to practice in these different things. That's why you need to get out and compete regularly to become a better competitor and athlete. So next time you come around, like, oh, I did that one on sand 2 years ago and this was horrible. So then okay, well, next time I'm going to do this. So that's that. I really appreciate you tuning in and watching this video. If you made it this far, I know we kind of broke down a lot, but I'd really love to hear any thoughts that you have on this in the comments. Really curious if I didn't cover anything, like you have a certain type of shoe that you wear, would love to hear from you. Let me know what you like for different things. As always, you can always shoot me a message on Instagram at StephenMCoin. Thank you for watching and have a championship day.